My name is Rolf Svanoe, and I live in Decorah, Iowa currently. Most recently, however, I was serving as a pastor at Greenfield Lutheran Church in Harmony, Minnesota. Was there for 4.5 years. Before that, back in South Dakota for 15 years, serving at a large Lutheran church there. Decided to come this direction because of grandchildren living in Rochester and wanting to be closer to them. But I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin. My father was a school educator. My father was born in Norway. He was actually born in Wisconsin, but grew up in Norway. He was 2 years old when the family moved back to Norway in 1909. So he spent his years from 2 years old to 12 years old back in Norway. So he grew up in Norway, and it was his native tongue. So when he came back to the United States, then in 1919, he had to learn English. I remember growing up, Dad was always interested in all things Norwegian and wanted his children to know about that too. We had to all the kids memorized the Norwegian table prayer, Jesu navn, and so there were lots of ways in which we were growing up with a Norwegian sort of Norwegian-American sort of ethnic identity. It was really important to my father to try and pass that on. When I have a twin sister, and when we were about 10 years old, Dad sent us for 2 summers. He sent us to the Concordia language camp to try and help us learn some Norwegian, which didn't really stick all that well, but of course when you're young, you know, you're not all that interested in those sorts of things. But yeah, so I grew up with this identity of being Norwegian-American. The name Svanøy comes from a Norwegian name. There's an island on the west coast of Norway, just about 2 hours north of Bergen by boat. It's called Svanøy. And øy is the word for island, and svan the word for swan. So the name actually means Swan Island. And that has been an important part of our sort of identity as Svanoe family members. So it was the story, as the story goes, my 3 times great-grandfather was from Hallingdal. He was a friend of Hans Nilsson Hauge, and Hauge was really interested in helping the poor to really excel and to do better in life, and was interested in helping people to develop their own businesses. And so he helped my 3 times great-grandfather to purchase this island. And so he moved from Hallingdal there to the west coast of Norway, bought the island, and began the process of starting to develop different kinds of businesses there, forestry and farming and mining, salt desalinization plants and things like that, fishing, all those sorts of things that developed, and there was quite a sort of pietistic business community that developed on this island. So this has all been a part of the story that I've grown up with, and I had the chance to visit the island for the first time in 1986. So I was probably about 32 or so, and it was like a spiritual experience, you know, just to be able to connect with roots in this place that I'd heard about all my life. I've returned there several times over the years. I've probably been to Norway 9 or 10 times, and have close relationships with family back in Norway. Still haven't learned to be conversant in Norwegian, but I'm working on that. Now that I'm retired, I'm hoping that this fall I can be more intentional about learning, becoming a little conversational in Norwegian. So he was, let's see, he was born in 1786,
Okay.
and he died in 1850.
Okay.
So, and he bought the island in 1804. So he was rather young, in his early 20s, when he bought the island. And but that's one of the things that the Haugi Pietist movement was really against the state church, and it was against the sort of class structure in the Norwegian society at that time, really trying to undermine that and help the lower classes to better themselves so that they weren't living in poverty so much. I think those are all rather laudable goals, you know. Yeah. So my 3 times great grandfather, his name was Ole Torjussen Helling Svanoe, and he became a leader in that area of Western Norway, and so he was invited then to, or he was elected to be part of the assembly that met in Eidsvoll to create the new constitution for Norway. That was in 1814. Unfortunately, there was bad weather in the western coast of Norway, and so he was prevented from attending that conference, or the constituting convention in Eidsvoll in May. However, because of the results of a war that happened in Europe, you know, then Norway was given to Sweden, and they had to reconvene. So they reconvened in November, and they created a new or a revised sort of constitution. And my 3 times great grandfather was there at that, and he is one of the signers of that constitution, and which is the constitution that governs Norway today. So, yeah. And so he became, he was part of the Storting. He was a Stortingsman, and his son Christopher also was, who was my 2 times great grandfather, was also a Stortingsman. So I have deep roots in Norway, and I often joke with members of my church that I'm 100% Norwegian, but I'm taking pills for it, you know. So. So my grandfather was a Lutheran pastor, and he finished his seminary studies in 1895, graduated from seminary in Oslo, and then in 1899 he came to Chicago to continue his studies, and he wanted to be a part of China Mission Society, and he wanted to go over to China to spread the gospel. Unfortunately, the Boxer Rebellion happened and the doors closed to China, so my grandfather stayed in the States. His first wife died after childbirth, became very sickly and died. And then my grandfather remarried and then married my grandmother. And they met in South Dakota. My grandfather's parents, my great-grandparents, were both rather sickly on the west coast of Norway, and so I think that's why they went back to Norway after my dad was born here in the States, and then they went back to take care of aging parents, and my grandfather served for about 10 years in a church over in Norway. On the west coast, yeah, very close to the area where the Svanøy island is, so yeah. And in 1919, so it would have been right after the World War I, and it would have been at the height of the pandemic, you know, the Spanish influenza that they had been. They came back to the United States, and I can't imagine now that we're in the middle of a pandemic, you know, that they would have traveled like that on ship and across the United States and train and in the middle of a pandemic, but they did. They ended up in South Dakota, and which is where my grandmother was born and was raised. In the southeast corner of South Dakota, near Yankton, a little town called Mission Hill. Yeah. So she was Norwegian, yes, right. Her parents both were from the Hedmark region, just south of Lillehammer, near the town of Brøttum, or Moelv, right on the east shore of Lake Mjøsa. And so they were both from there. In fact, my great-grandparents were first cousins. And, well, that was revelatory, because I knew that my father's parents, my father's grandparents on both sides, I learned were both first cousins. And I said, boy, that really explains a lot. But I think that was more common back then, you know. But thankfully, others come in and they diversify the gene pool, you know, so that they're our salvation. So the closest relatives I have, one would be a first cousin who grew up in Ohio, but she studied in Norway. She went to a year of high school in Bergen and then loved it so much she ended up staying in Norway. So I have first cousins once removed. They're actually half cousins. We share the same grandfather but a different grandmother. And they live in Bergen, and we're in very close contact with them still. When we go to visit them, we often will go up to their cabin on fjord, just below the Sognefjord, where the Sognefjord meets the North Sea. There's a little town there called Evenvik, and that's where we oftentimes will vacation. No. No. But thankfully, you know, all the Norwegians, they all speak English. Yeah, so it's not as crucial. Although the first time I went to Norway, I visited with one of my third cousins who was on the island, and he was giving us a tour, and he did not know English, and I didn't know Norwegian. But he had learned German in World War II, so he could communicate with the German soldiers that were on the island. And I had studied German in college and spent a semester learning German over in Germany, so we could speak together in German. So. I don't think it really did, although I'm not as familiar with the kind of communication that went across the ocean at that time. I think the primary reason they left was the war had ended, but also that my great-grandparents had both died at that point. And with a growing family, there were 6 kids, and from age 12 to newborn. And my grandmother said, you know, Western Norway on a remote island, you know, was not the place for kids to get a good education. So she insisted on moving back to the United States so that the kids could get a better education. Yeah, so when they moved back to the United States, they lived for a year in Mission Hill, which was largely Norwegian immigrants, and many immigrants from the Ringsaker parish in Norway. And then they moved to Canton, South Dakota, which is also a very large Norwegian immigrant population. And finally, when the kids were old enough for college, they moved up to Sioux Falls and attended Augustana College. In fact, there were 4 brothers that were attending college at the same time. So, yeah, that would be a big burden, yeah, for sure. He did. Well, I'm sure he became fluent in English as well, living here and having to work here. Yeah, he continued to serve. Although my grandfather, he had this I think, a love-hate relationship with America. And he ended up going back to Norway several times. In fact, the last time he went back to Norway was in the late 30s, and he was stuck in Norway for the duration of World War II. So I don't think he got back to the United States until about 1946. So he was there for about 7-8 years. And so it was very difficult for Grandma, you know. They were very poor, so, yeah. Well, there was a pretty well-established genealogy on the Svanøy side, especially, that I could draw upon. And since then, I've become very good at navigating the digital archives over in Norway and becoming very familiar with the parish records and the census records and things like that, and being able to corroborate and source everything in my genealogy to those original documents. So I've done that. My mother was also very interested in genealogy. She was also full Norwegian, and she had ancestry in Numedal and in Valdres area, also in Hallingdal and Gol, Hallingdal area. So yeah, today I have ancestry all over, especially central Norway, you know, yeah. So. I often get people who send me, like they'll scan a document, you know, they don't read Norwegian, and they'll say, can you translate this for me? And I know enough Norwegian, especially some of those, you know, confirmations documents and baptism documents, wedding documents. You know, I can read some of those things and be able to translate it for them, you know. And I've also done a bit of genealogy work for other people. So one guy in my congregation said to me, boy, he'd love to go to Norway. He's just wondering if you had any relatives there. And so I just started researching his background. I traced his background back to Norway, and then I developed it forward to see if he had any cousins. And lo and behold, he had cousins living real close to the airport for Oslo, Gardermoen Airport. And I said to him, you know, Roger, you know, all you have to do is just fly there. They'll come to the airport and pick you up, you know, and they'll show you a good time. So, yeah. Sure, yeah. So, I mentioned that my 3 times great-grandfather had purchased this island in 1804. So in 1904, there was a big Jubilee anniversary. In 2004, we also had another big anniversary. So there were about 300 people that joined in on this, this celebration, and 75 of them were from the United States. So that we all met on the island. So we took the whole family there, and which was rather expensive, and we had to pay several years to pay that off. But you know, it's one of those things that are just priceless that you just have to do, and you can't miss out on that. And in 2008, in my previous church in Sioux Falls, which was a large church and had a lot of people of Norwegian-American ancestry, and many people were saying, you know, Pastor Rolf, you should take us over to Norway. And so I developed a tour in 2008, and that was the first of about a dozen tours that I've led over the last 12 years or so to different parts of Europe and the Holy Land. But I've been to Norway. I've led 3 tours to Norway and planning a 4th tour next year, hopefully if there's a vaccine for the coronavirus. And yeah, I was supposed to be in Norway right now, but that got canceled. So yeah, the one tour I did in 2017. So we had about 40 people that went to Norway with me, and if any of them had any Norwegian ancestry, then I did some genealogy work for them. And if we were going to be anywhere as close to where their ancestry was, then I tried to make special arrangements for them to be able to connect with people or to visit an ancestral farm or something like that. And for many of them, that was the highlight of the trip, you know, just to be able to do that. So it's really special. Yeah, I'm not sure I've ever made a direct connection between my theology, my religious views as a Lutheran, and any particular Norwegian-American influences that I've had. Other than, you know, the occasional Ole and Lena joke that I tell in the sermons, you know, that people always enjoy, you know, they get a good laugh at them. But I do have to say that I have served 5 churches over my 36 years of ministry, and the last church that I've been at in Harmony is the only church that's had a lutefisk supper, and I was just so happy to finally be in a church that had a lutefisk supper, and to be with these people who've preserved these traditions of lefse making and kroomkake and rosettes and fatiman and all kinds of things, and to be there with them and to get your hands, you know, dirty working and peeling potatoes and doing all kinds of stuff to get ready for a Norwegian dinner that we would serve every other year. It was really special. I really enjoyed that so much. Sure. Mostly it was just lefse. I do remember Mom making rosettes, but lefse and flatbread. She would make flatbread. Dad would eat fiskeboller, and I did not like that at all. I do remember my father was very active in Sons of Norway, and also sang in a Norwegian men's chorus in Madison, Wisconsin, where we grew up. And I do remember going to lutefisk suppers. We didn't serve lutefisk so much at home, but we'd have the lutefisk suppers that we were all involved in. And every time I sit down to a plate of lutefisk, my father is just all of a sudden sitting next to me, and his plate is just heaping with lutefisk, lots of melted butter and salt, and he just relished it. And I don't relish it as much, but I do enjoy lutefisk, so yeah. Well, it's been rewarding that my own children, I have 2 daughters, and they both seem to have embraced, you know, their ethnic identity, you know, as Norwegian Americans. When my oldest got married, she wanted to take engagement pictures. She married a man whose mother was Nigerian, and so he was dressed in traditional Nigerian costume, and she wanted to be dressed in a traditional bunad, Norwegian. And they were living in San Francisco, so I contacted one of my, on my Svanøy side, a distant cousin who was living out there, and very involved in this Norwegian Seamen's Church in San Francisco. And she knew somebody who had a bunad that my daughter was able to borrow. And then we found a Norwegian crown that the brides usually wore, and we ordered that for her to wear. And so she got pictures taken, and he was with his Nigerian costume. And yeah. When we went over to Norway for this big family reunion in 2004, and I have this picture of my 2 daughters and some of their cousins, and we're on the boat heading north from Bergen, and they had this family tree spread out in front of them, and they're all pointing to the tree and trying to find their place on the tree and how they're related to each other. And to me, that picture is just priceless, you know. Yeah, so it's neat. I mean, they're not as invested in their Norwegian identity. I mean, they're thoroughly American, you know, but they do love Norway, and they love they're rather proud of Norway and what Norwegians have been able to accomplish in terms of the way they govern themselves, the way they've handled the coronavirus pandemic, but also I think the equality, the egalitarianism that Norwegians experience, and they're rather proud of their ethnic identity, I think. You know. Yeah, not so much. I think my grandfather, who was a Lutheran pastor, he was accused by some of not so much being a collaborator with the Nazis, but a little more sympathetic than maybe he should have been. And that's about one of the only things that I've really heard so much about World War II and the experience there. Yeah, well, let's see. Our name is rather hard to pronounce for some Americans, you know, and they want to turn it from 2 syllables into 3 syllables. Instead of saying Svanoe, to get the S and the V together is Svanøy is kind of how, and we oftentimes use the same sort of litany. S as in Sam, V as in Victor, A-N-O-E. Of course, in Norway, it's /O, which we don't have in our alphabet. Well, yeah, it took us a while to, it took me a while when I would go over there and say my name, you know, and I was mispronouncing it according to them, so yeah. I think one of the fun sorts of stories is hearing how kind of idiosyncratic my grandfather was. I mean, he was kind of strange, and the fact that you know, both of his parents were first cousins might explain some of that. But my grandfather, I don't know if this is a typical Norwegian thing, but they used to tell stories about how in Norway he would chop a hole in the ice and then jump in, you know. And when he came back to the States, and in his old age he lived with us in our home. We had an apartment in the basement, and my older siblings tell the story of how Grandpa would go on into the bathroom, and he'd turn the shower on. He'd turn the cold water on and just let it get good and cold, and then he'd step in the shower. And I think that was just a part of his Norwegian experience, you know. But the other part was Grandpa was really into nutrition, and he was convinced that by mixing his saliva with every bite of food, that would help his digestion. And so he would chew every bite of food at least 30 times, and it would take him hours to finish his meal. And my older siblings would talk about how impatient they got with Grandpa, because he'd be sitting there chewing away. Even his milk, you know, he'd chew. So I don't know if that's a particularly Norwegian thing or if it's just a Grandpa thing, but yeah, anyway, we laugh about those.